Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this latest edition of Tales from Outer Space, where I take stories from across the internet and read them for your entertainment. This particular story is called An Ordinary Old Man, written by TheCurserHasntMoved. Like most Kowakwal children, Jai found humans endlessly fascinating. Their heroic cartoons, thrilling tales, and legendary feats amongst the Star Sailors made them larger than life. Humans had more traditional heroes, scientists, explorers, and the like, and those were exciting enough. However, they were made famous by their unorthodox heroes that enthralled even the placid hearts of the Quakal. These warriors, vigilantes, adventurers, and other such dynamic characters were certainly unorthodox, but they still enthralled children and adults alike. However, Jai actually knew a human, unlike the majority of her friends and classmates. It was just as well, though, as nobody would ever believe that her neighbor, Mr. Mark, was just normal. He never did anything heroic or bombastic or ridiculous or exciting in any way, and, if anything, was rather boring and uninteresting. Bent over with age, even what Jai understood to be low gravity to humans. Mr. Mark spent most of his days plodding around his orderly front garden, tending to delicate flowers and finicky shrubberies. But he also made sure to always say hello and keep up with the little doings of the neighborhood. Indeed, Jai was almost embarrassed to know Mr. Mark, since she knew that if her classmates ever found out about him, they'd all hound her for stories about his heroic exploits, and wouldn't believe that a human could be so mundane as to just be an elderly man who simply tends a garden in his retirement. So, for as Jai or anybody in the neighborhood was concerned, the only thing about Mr. Mark that was stereotypically human was his diminutive stature. Even their famed friendliness seemed lacking in him, which wasn't to say that he was unfriendly. It was just that the man seemed somewhat introverted and reluctant to discuss what led him to living on a planet so different to where he was born and raised, surrounded by what to him was an alien race. Just so, he was so unrelentingly ordinary that Jai at least simply never thought to ask. A human might think it strange that she never thought to ask how he got a deep burn scar across his cheek, or why his cane, slender and well-worn cane, looked like it was topped with a standard issue RNI bayonet handle. If Jai had ever been amongst humans on their own worlds, perhaps she would have known that the meticulous order with which he kept his garden was odd. Or perhaps she'd know that most humans like a lion just as much as any Quokal, and that Mr. Mark's pre-dawn routine was likewise unusual. Maybe she'd even looked at the scar on his face and concluded that it was from a laser graze, and asked how he'd gotten it if she could picture him anywhere other than amongst the delicate flowers he tended to so assiduously. Nobody ever ventured to ask, and he never volunteered to tell about anything other than the mundane village doings of the neighborhood, but maybe those who knew that much knew not to pry. More to the point, Jai couldn't remember a time when Mr. Mark wasn't her neighbor. To her, a human waving to her as she walked home from school and asking how her day had been was completely normal, even if every story, picture, video stream, or other example of far-off humans was unrelentingly exciting and dynamic. Mr. Mark was just part of the neighborhood, and that's nothing to be terribly curious about. It wasn't until Jai's class went on a field trip to Gratitude's colonial capital that she had any cause to wonder about her neighbor's past. A civics-focused field trip wasn't exactly her idea of exciting in the first place, not like one focused on science or engineering or even history. Though such a young colony as Gratitude only had a few sites of historical interest, of course. Still, there was a chance to visit the city with a little more activity than a home village, not to mention the intended purpose of learning about the civic services of the colony and how they function. Important, to be sure, but perhaps not the most enthralling of subjects for a girl like Jai. It was this lack of interest which led Jai to wander around the fringes of the tour group during the colonial administration building segment, focused on the kinds of administrations the colony had heretofore functioned under, and how the current administration arbitrated civil disputes. The various memorials tucked into alcoves around the circular room for that purpose captured far more of her attention than the tour guide's prepared speech about the ongoing case. A small bronze statue of a dignified Kokal man who had apparently discovered a rich mineral deposits on which the colony was founded occupied one alcove. In another, there was a young child who discovered that non-dye was delicious as well as non-toxic, and a few other examples of pioneers and discoverers, all except one memorial, which despite being no more ornate or in a place of particular honor, stood out nonetheless. A small cluster of cast bronze statues depicted 7 humans stood in a line, faces cast in grim determination, clothes swept by a long-forgotten wind, and each clasped a fearsome weapon in his hands, all accompanied by a burnished plaque inscribed simply, "Though you had no cause to help, and we had no way to repay, you risked your very lives in our most desperate hour. Late in coming, and more than you'd expect, here we record the names of you magnificent 7. Alan Coring, Dustin Lee, Cole York, John Shepard, Javier Martinez, Ivan Ivanov, and Mark Jackson. May your names endure as long as what you've preserved." The statue would have been a minor curiosity, and the most desperate hour something to look up later when she was bored. But Jai was certain, absolutely certain, that in the back on the far left was Mr. Mark. He was straight back, clear-eyed and unsmiling, but the artist had taken obvious care to replicate the laser scar on his face. And while humans collected scars like normal people collected stories, she was sure that it was Mr. Mark. Her heart raced, her breathing became shallow, and she tried to reconcile what she thought she knew about her small corner of still largely unsettled planet. Jai was so excited that she interrupted the tour guide. "Excuse me, miss. Do you know what happened to these humans?" She began distractedly before her eyes fell upon the statue. After a moment of hushed anticipation, she continued hesitantly, almost as if she thought the statue might be offended by his gossip. "Oh, them. Well, I don't really know. I suppose they all went off to have more adventures. Typical human things, you know, although rumor has it that one of them settled down somewhere here to retire." "Do you know anything about the most desperate hour?" The tour guide's first stood an end, as if in shock, as she looked out over her expectant audience. "You haven't learned yet? Well, how quickly the past fades." She looked towards the statue once more, and stood up straighter before beginning in a stronger voice. "Well, I didn't prepare for explaining history, strange as it feels to call it that. Gratitude is a strange name amongst us for a colony world, but it fits us all the same. For everyone here has much to be grateful for. Many of you take pride in the competitive ruggedness of gratitude to the other worlds we can inhabit. But this meant that only a generation ago our fair colony stood a fair chance of failure. My father still talks about how bad the harvest was, how dangerous the inrads were, and how devastating the outlaw raids were. See, unbeknownst to us, scoundrels, outcasts, and ruffians from several stellar nations had established a small base on the planet, and they saw our struggling forefathers as a source for easy food and entertainment. As fortune would have it, those 7 simply happened to visit us, having chosen our system at random on what they called a road trip, which was apparently a traditional name for this kind of adventure. The outlaws attacked when the humans happened to be sampling a restaurant in a struggling town, and instead of running to their ship to run away, they ran to their ship to retrieve weapons. My father says that they left a few days later and wouldn't accept any kind of reward. Jine had difficulty paying attention to what was supposed to be an educational experience meant to explore civics, as the impromptu history lesson had been far more interesting. She restrained herself from interrupting again, as the poor tour guide didn't seem to be prepared to discuss history. However, that did not stop her from storing up questions for later. Why did the Magnificent 7 have weapons on their ship? Why did they decide to help a small town of strangers? Why didn't they want a reward after risking their lives? How did they defeat the ruffians? How many ruffians were there? Presumably, it was more than an entire town could handle themselves. But in that case, how did only 7 humans make up such a difference? If Mr. Mark was really Mark Jackson, why didn't he talk about his heroics? It was all terribly exciting and intriguing, but she had to wait to pursue her new interests until, at the earliest, she was at home. The shuttle ride back to school was abuzz with curious questions and speculations of her classmates. Everyone claimed to know someone who said that they knew one of the Magnificent Seven, and even where they lived. If the gaggle of boastful children were to be believed, all 7 of the mysterious humans lived in 24 locations and regularly went on trips to beat up pirates in fistfights. Jai knew better, or suspected better anyway. She spent the ride back ruminating in silence. She spent the walk home from school in much the same way, and had resolved to simply let the past lie. When she did finally reach home, as fortune would have it, Mr. Mark was in his garden, watering shrubbery, and she couldn't resist the urge to ask, "Are you Mark Jackson, Mr. Mark?" Jai thought she saw Mr. Mark's shoulders tense under his shirt, and she tried to keep her ears from laying back in embarrassment. Then he sighed and said, "Yes, that's my name." Jai waited a moment, and when it looked to her like Mr. Mark was not offended, she pressed on, "Of the Magnificent Seven?" Mr. Mark made a snorting noise that Jai thought might have been laughed at. He said, "We never called ourselves something so silly. We were just a bunch of old vets out to see the stars at peace." "Oh, then why did you help?" "Because if somebody's in trouble and you can help them, it's just the right thing to do." "But you could have been killed." "We could have been killed by a meteor striking our ship during takeoff, and there is less anyone could do about that." Jai let her ears lay back from exasperation as she said, "Mr. Mark, please don't make fun of me." "I'm sorry, kiddo. I mean that there's always a risk to do anything, and that's just a part of life. The risk to our bodies in order to do the right thing was acceptable. Does that make sense?" Jai thought it over for a moment and slowly said, "Yes, I think it does. But you're a hero. You have a statue in the capital. You could be famous if you wanted." "I could," he agreed tersely. "You don't want to be famous?" "No. I like my garden, and I like to watch what we saved by a stroke of luck grow and flourish. I don't really need a better reward." "I said that you're a hero. What does it mean amongst humans?" Well, someone who does the right thing, even though it costs them, maybe their lives. Someone who can look their fears in the face and go forward anyway. Someone who never thinks about what the buddies he left behind owe him for, and generally, a hero won't think that he's won." Jai nodded slowly and asked, "Would you be offended if I asked you about that day, and about the veterans you mentioned?" "It's not easy to offend me, kid." "I want to know the story." A long moment of silence passed between them before he answered, "All right, I'll tell you what, not for free. You'll have to bring cake." A moment of silence passed between them before Jai said, "Thank you, Mr. Mark. I'll bring some for sure." End of story. I'd quickly like to thank the T5 peeps: Cold War Boomerwaffen, Severin Cerberus, Bushmaster 177, Henry the Red, Caspar Arnholtz, Cold War Boomerwaffen, Elijah Silvercross, Dragzoon WRE, and Severin Cerberus. Thank you very much.